The Palestinian people are being starved, bombed, and forcibly displaced by Israel, their unlawful occupier.
The International Court of Justice hears another case against Israel in what could be a test of Israeli defiance of international law. More than 40 nations argue its ban on the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees is a breach of the UN Charter. So can the World Court hold Israel to account? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly Thibault. On the first of 5 days of hearings at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, Palestinian officials have told judges that Israel is using humanitarian aid as a weapon of war. More than 40 countries are arguing that Israel's November decision to stop all coordination with the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, is a breach of the UN founding charter. But however the court rules, the result will be an advisory opinion. That means it's a suggestion, non-binding. And Israel has shown in the past it has no issue ignoring international law. So can the ICJ make a difference this time? And will any decision made in Europe have an impact on the millions of Palestinians in Gaza struggling to find food under an Israeli blockade that's now lasted nearly 2 months? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. First, this report from Laura Khan.
Children among the huge crowds push to fill their empty plates, knowing that food is running out in Gaza. This desperate situation has been made worse by Israel's heavy bombardment and more than 2 months of its total blockade on food, medicine and fuel to the Strip.
The coming days in Gaza are going to be critical. Today, people are not surviving in Gaza. Those that aren't being killed with bombs and bullets are slowly dying.
Everyone is suffering from malnutrition, especially the children. What are the children eating? They spend all day standing in the line at the food kitchen to get rice or beans, and sometimes there is none.
In stark contrast to the streets are these empty distribution centres belonging to UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. Not only is it facing severe shortages, but also Israel's total ban on its operations across the Palestinian territories, far beyond the blockaded fences of Gaza. Israel is facing legal pressure at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Monday's hearing goes beyond Israel's blockade of aid and examines whether Israel's ban on UNRWA violated the UN's founding charter. The court can only offer an advisory opinion, but can carry political weight. Israel has long advocated for the dismantling of the UN agency. It accuses some of its members of involvement in the October 7th attacks. Of its 14,000 members working in Gaza, UNRWA found 9 people may have been involved and no longer work with them. Now, the agency has been forced to shut down schools, clinics, community centres, and Israel has revoked visas for international staff. Back in the ICJ, Palestinian representatives were the first to speak in the hearing.
This campaign of erasure was a central hallmark of the Nakba that started in 1947 and whose darkest chapter yet unfolding before our eyes and yours. On 3 separate occasions in the past years, the court issued provisional measures ordering Israel, among other things, to ensure and facilitate the unimpeded flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Israel did not comply, weaponizing food and humanitarian aid and negating refugee issue and their rights, including by banning UNRWA.
Now the focus will be on the ICJ and UN states' decisions as to whether they will defend the UN body or whether the hearing will result in further Israeli defiance of international law. Laura Khan, Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Now let's take a closer look at UNRWA. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency was created in 1949 to provide assistance to Palestinian refugees. There were 750,000 back then. Now 5.9 million Palestinians are eligible for UNRWA support. The UN agency runs schools, healthcare facilities, and also women's centres and microfinancing. UNRWA doesn't just operate in the occupied territories, it's also in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. But it's in Gaza, where the small strip has been bombed, besieged, and starved, that the agency's operations are most needed and most in danger of complete collapse. Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Oxford, in the UK, Sam Rose, who's the Senior Acting Director of UNRWA Affairs in Gaza. In the Canadian city of London, Michael Lynk, who is a human rights lawyer and Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Law at Western University. And in Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, who's a columnist with the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being with us on Inside Story. Sam Rose, if I can start with you. The UN General Assembly first asked the ICJ to weigh on Israel's legal obligations a year ago. Since then, we've had tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, and for the past 2 months, there's been a total blockade of Gaza. What are you hoping this new case is going to achieve? What value do proceedings like this one have in the immediate?
Thank you, and thanks for having me on. Look, firstly, we hope that we welcome the case. It's very timely, but it's also increasingly and incredibly urgent. We have been talking to the media, advocating with member states every day, several times a day, for 18 months now about the plight of the civilian population in Gaza, whose misery, the inhumanity and the cruelty and humiliation that they face is just deteriorating on a daily basis. Right now, things are quickly going from very bad to worse. The colleagues that we speak to on the ground, the refugee communities that we speak to on the ground, they have nothing. This is beyond any level of suffering that we've seen in this most dehumanizing of conflicts. And conflicts in Gaza and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts over the past 75 years. So now is the time for the lawyers to deliberate, but more than that, now is the time for action, because we are running out of time to meet these needs of the population in Gaza, which has immediate implications for them, but longer-term implications for everyone in the region.
Sam, let me ask you, what has the ban meant for UNRWA, the ban by the Israeli Knesset, which came into effect in January last year? What have been the real-life consequences of that ban for the people who work for UNRWA, but also for the people who depend on UNRWA?
Yeah, I mean, the ban had two elements to it. One was banning UNRWA's activities on the sovereign territory of Israel. The other element to it was prohibiting contact between UNRWA and Israeli officials. Now, I work for UNRWA and I represent UNRWA inside of Gaza. So in theory, of course, the laws do not impinge on our activities inside of Gaza. The reality is, though, that we have to coordinate and we have to communicate with the Israeli authorities on a daily basis to do our work, to bring the supplies into Gaza. We're going through Israeli-controlled borders, and for our international staff to move in and out, that has to be done in liaison with the Israeli authorities who control all the borders right now. So I am speaking to you from Oxford because I, as the director of UNRWA in Gaza, I'm not able to enter the Gaza Strip right now. We still, as you said at the top, have 15,000 colleagues working on a daily basis, but it impacts the ability of international staff to enter. It impacts our ability to bring supplies in as well that also have to go through Israeli-controlled borders. And of course, we can turn to the situation in the West Bank in a bit, but the impact on our services in East Jerusalem for children, for patients, etc.
All right, Gideon, let me bring you into the conversation. We have yet to hear Israel's defense in this case because it's absent from the proceedings at The Hague, but we do already have an idea of what it's saying to try and justify terminating the agreement with UNRWA and banning the agency's activities. How is this new case, first of all, at the ICJ against Israel being viewed in Israel? And does Israel's refusal to cooperate with UNRWA represent a legitimate security concern, or is it a part of a broader political strategy?
First of all, Israel is not concerned at all about it because it's even hardly informed. The hearing in The Hague, it took me some time to find it in Israeli media outlet. Israel turns toward the world. And this is just one chain in this behavior, in this perception that the whole world is anti-Semitic, and therefore we turn our back to the world. We don't participate in the Pope's funeral because he criticized Israel. We are expelling an UNRWA senior worker who lived here for 17 years, married to an Israeli, has 3 Israeli children. She came to Israel for a short visit and they expelled her from the airport. Israel is doing anything possible to turn into a pariah state, even by its own policy, not only by the attitude of the world. And this hearing now will have no effect on Israelis, because for Israelis, UNRWA, like the ICJ, like the UN, like any other international organization, is anti-Semitic. And therefore, we can only ignore their advices. You know, Folly, so many times I ask myself, what does Israel want? You killed 55,000 people. You destroyed Gaza. What do you want now? Why not to give humanitarian aid to those displaced poor people? What is the logic?
Yeah, it's an important question you ask, Gideon, no doubt. Michael, Lynk, let me come to you and to this ICJ case and these new hearings there. Legally speaking, Michael, how does international law weigh a state's right to sovereignty against its responsibility to uphold human rights and international humanitarian law? In other words, does Israel today have any legal basis for blocking UNRWA?
No, I guess the short answer is, and I think that's going to be heard all week long by most of the states and international organizations who are going to be speaking to the court. There are 2 legal issues, both of them related to each other, that are before the court. First is what are the privileges and immunities of the United Nations? And it's very clear in the Charter of the United Nations, which Israel is bound by, and by the 1946 Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, that the facilities and buildings and work of the United Nations in whatever territory of a state that they're in are to be absolutely protected. And that includes, obviously, their presence in the occupied territory, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza. So that's one of the issues in front of the court. The other is the one that you've spoken to with Sam, is what are the obligations of an occupying power under the international humanitarian law, and particularly the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which is the beating heart of IHL. And basically, one of the absolute fundamental obligations any state has, particularly in a zone of conflict or a zone of occupation, you cannot harm the civilians who are under your control, and particularly you cannot starve them. We thought that was something that was all done with the end of the Second World War, the creation of a modern body of international law, and here we are 80 years after the end of the Second World War, and we see vast starvation deliberately imposed.
So what happens, Michael, before I come back to you, Sam, what happens if it's found that Israel is indeed in violation of the UN Charter? What action could the United Nations take? I mean, could the UN General Assembly decide to expel Israel as one of its members, for example?
That certainly is something that may be on the table. Let's keep in mind that Israel is in defiance of more than 30 Security Council resolutions over the last 5 decades. It's in violation of scores of resolutions coming from the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. Much less was needed back in 1974 for the United Nations General Assembly not to recognize the credentials of apartheid South Africa, and indeed kept that state out of the organization for the next 20 years. If Israel defies this again and proceeds with this man-made famine, then I think you're going to start seeing action by some members of the General Assembly to question whether Israel should continue its status as a member of the United Nations.
All right. Sam, your thoughts about what is likely to happen here and what you're hoping this new hearing is going to achieve. Some countries like the US have said that perhaps if aid is not delivered through UNRWA, that other UN agencies could step in. What do you make of that? And would that undermine UNRWA's mandate if other UN agencies were to step in and fill the void that is being left by UNRWA?
Thanks. I mean, look, we're hoping for immediate action given the urgency of the situation inside of Gaza. We also recognize how polarizing this situation is, as Michael alluded to, and Gideon as well. But UNRWA is the provider of key basic services in Gaza and has been for 75 years, as you showed in your graphic, educating in Gaza alone hundreds upon hundreds, over 1 million children have gone through UNRWA schools, some of the most literate people in the region, including girls. Everything's been reduced to a supply of aid and boxes of aid and food parcels through a border, which is both incredibly dehumanizing, but also ignorant of what people need to live a dignified life. And yes, WFP could quite easily bring the aid in to Gaza. They'd need UNRWA's assistance to get it to the people who need it as quickly as possible. What we're talking about here are the 16,000 people a day who go to UNRWA's health clinics, the 500,000 people a day who receive clean water, who receive garbage collection services from UNRWA. These are systems that we've put in place with the support of the international community over decades. And it's those that will not be easily replaced. And that's the plight of the civilian population of Gaza if UNRWA's services are further constrained.
Gideon, UNRWA, as Sam said there, is the only UN agency specifically dedicated to Palestinian refugees and which explicitly maintains the political definition of Palestinian refugees. So are Israel's attacks on UNRWA also part of a broader campaign, perhaps, to erase not just the Palestinian suffering, but also Palestinian identity and Palestinian rights altogether, that right to return that is part of UNRWA's mandate?
No doubt that this step is just, as I said before, one chain, and it has a much broader context, namely, and above all, to tyrannize the life of the Palestinian and to make them leave. That's the wet dream of Israel. That's the wet dream of the right-wingers in Israel. And anything is permitted in this, anything is legitimate to reach this goal. I don't see any alternative to UNRWA. And you know what? Let's say that Israel has its own thoughts about UNRWA and they think that UNRWA is destructive. In the middle of the war, after destroying Gaza, that's the time to close UNRWA. This shows the real intentions. And the real intentions is to starve Gaza to death, not less than this.
How do domestic political dynamics, Gideon, within Israel shape its approach to international rulings and to these humanitarian criticism that it's facing right now?
As the late Henry Kissinger once said, Israel does not have foreign policy, it has only domestic politics. And it's being quoted in the recent months again and again. Many of Israel's steps in Gaza have their sources and their rationalization in domestic politics. And this makes it just much more outrageous, because there is no strategic goal right now in continuing the war. It's all about satisfying the right-wingers and the fascists in order to keep the government in power, because otherwise it falls apart. But we have to remember that it didn't start now. It is part of the thought of Israel, and be it right or wrong, you'll ask any Israeli, he will tell you the whole world is against us. No matter what we do, the world is against us. And if he is against us, it's his blame, not our blame. And therefore we can do whatever we want. Not to speak about the fact that we are the chosen people and nobody is going to tell us what to do. That's the mindset.
All right. Thank you for explaining that to us so clearly. Michael, so then given that the ICJ is an advisory body and that Israel is, we're hearing from Gideon there, is unlikely to comply with any ruling, what do you think are some of the mechanisms or international pressure even that could be helpful here to pressure, to enforce any ICJ guidance that will come about as a result of this latest hearing?
You're absolutely right. I mean, the ICJ can issue advisory opinions. As you've said, these are non-binding, but they are a very authoritative statement on international law by the most respected international court that we have. And the ability of ICJ advisory opinions or rulings depends upon the political will of the Security Council to fulfill them. And that's not going to happen as long as the Americans have a veto. So I think we shift our attention to the other international court that's in The Hague, the International Criminal Court, which actually does have teeth. 125 states in the world are members of the International Criminal Court. When arrest warrants are issued, all 125 states are obliged under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court to arrest those.
But as we saw, I mean, the ICC issued arrest warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the former defense minister, but that hasn't led to anything.
No, and you're right. With the one trip that Benjamin Netanyahu has made to an ICC member has been to Hungary, and not ironically enough, Hungary is one of the two states, along with the United States, that is appearing before the International Court of Justice this week on this advisory opinion request, likely to argue in protection and in favor of Israel. But don't underestimate the scope of the ICC's power with respect to this.
So just to clarify, Michael, could the ICJ's findings contribute to further action at the International Criminal Court and other courts?
Yes, of course. I mean, what the ICJ does is paid attention to by the ICC and vice versa. If and when the ICJ decides on the separate advisory matter with respect to the application by South Africa under the Genocide Convention. That is going to be paid by close attention to by the ICC with respect to the prosecutor's decision to perhaps expand the number of arrest warrants and perhaps to expand the number of grounds for which these Israeli officials will be charged with.
All right, Sam, let me come to you now and ask you about what next. I mean, the legal ramifications of this case are profound, but there's also a real human cost here. How do we ensure that the people on the ground in Gaza, in the occupied West Bank, are not forgotten in these legal debates, especially when international aid and resources, as we've been seeing for the past 2 months, are being blocked by Israel?
I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, this is a conflict that has received unparalleled levels of attention. The pictures, the images that we'll never forget sit into our minds in terms of what's happening to the people. We are committed as UNRWA and the rest of the humanitarian community inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, to continue pushing those messages out to make sure that the needs, the suffering, the rights of the population aren't forgotten, the civilian population, and that there is accountability for wrongdoing on all sides. But look, this will only be addressed through political will. If there's political will to open the borders now to ensure an orderly and respectful immediate release of hostages, but to put this conflict on the path to a solution so that Palestinians can enjoy the same rights and freedoms as their neighbors in Israel. Without that, we'll just repeat this again and again every few years. And if this conflict, and it's shocking to say it after 18 months, is not yet a wake-up call to the world on this, then I dread to think what will be.
Gideon Levy in Tel Aviv, will that political will that Sam talked about there, will it ever come in Israel?
No, it will not come in Israel, but the real challenge is for the international community. There's a member state of the UN which is banning a very important UN agency. There must be some kind of consequences to this. There is a member state of the UN which violates the international law on a daily basis. There must be some consequences to it. And the challenge is not Israel, the challenge is of the international community, which is hugging Israel again and again and preventing any kind of accountability. And if this will continue, there will be no solution. The solution will not come from within Israel. Israelis will not wake up one shining morning and say, oh, what's going on in Gaza is not so nice. Let's put an end to it. No, it will only be when they will be taken accountable and will also pay a price for it by the international community. So the challenge is on the shoulders of the international community.
Michael Lynk, where do you think the solution will come from? And what will we get at the end of this latest ICJ hearing? And could also the states that provide military support and political support to Israel ultimately be held complicit under international law if the ICJ were to determine that Israel's blockade constitutes a serious violation?
Yes, look, while international law doesn't have its own judges and it doesn't have its own armies, that depends upon the political will of the UN and its leading members in order to be able to enforce. There is a huge amount of legitimacy attached to decisions by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. So with this number of decisions that Israel has been defined from the Security Council, the General Assembly, the previous advisory opinions coming from the International Court of Justice, and obviously as well, these arrest warrants that have been issued by the International Criminal Court, Israel's legitimacy as a fair-minded player in the international system is taking yet more hits with respect to this. But we will only end the occupation, we'll only have the realization of the Palestinian right of self-determination when the international community becomes mobilized enough to finally impose a cost upon Israel. Israel has had an occupation now for 57, almost 58 years, with virtually no cost at all, politically or economically for this. Only when Israelis wake up and realize, gee, now I need a visa to go to Europe. Gee, the prices of our goods are now becoming much more expensive because of the increasing blockades or the divestment coming from the international community. Only then, I think, will you see a significant change in Israeli public opinion, and perhaps then the path to Palestinian self-determination.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for a very fascinating discussion. Sam Rose, Gideon Levy, Michael Lynk. Thanks to all three of you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you, too, for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.